Okay, so those provincial alcohol bans. Ontario has been among the most adamant that U.S. booze won't be going back on LCBO shelves, as key sectors in the province, including steel, aluminum, and the auto industry, continue to feel the pinch of tariffs.
Year. New Nanos polling done between July 28th and 30th shows almost 3/4 of Canadians are having serious doubts about whether they would buy American booze if it were to come back onto store shelves. 69% saying that they are unlikely, and 5% saying they are somewhat unlikely to do so. So that is a total of 74%, up by 4% from last year. Now, broken down geographically, we can see on this map here that British Columbians are the most unlikely to buy U.S. booze, followed by Ontario and Quebec, all provinces where booze bans are in place.
Canada is sending a warning to American bourbon makers that they may not be ready for. Even if U.S. alcohol comes back to Canadian stores, shoppers may not come back with it. The problem is no longer just a government ban. Something has changed with Canadian buyers, and that could leave American brands facing a much bigger loss. American bourbon makers just received devastating news, and it has nothing to do with whether the ban gets lifted. A new Nanos poll found that 74% of Canadians would refuse to buy U.S. alcohol even if it returned to store shelves tomorrow. The poll data is specific and striking. Just under 3/4 of Canadians, 74%, report they are somewhat unlikely or not likely to buy American alcohol if it were put back on store shelves. Breaking that down, 69% said they were simply not likely, with another 5% somewhat unlikely. The survey, conducted by Nanos Research between July 28th and 30th, 2026, polled 1,104 Canadians with a margin of error of 3 percentage points. This was not a narrow finding. Nearly 3 in 4 Canadians are signaling they have moved on from American alcohol entirely. What makes the number especially alarming for U.S. producers is the direction it is moving. The proportion of Canadians unlikely to buy American alcohol has increased from the previous year, rising to 74% from 70% in 2025. The boycott is not fading as the trade war drags on. It is hardening. A year into the dispute, more Canadians say they will avoid American alcohol than did at the start. That trend is the opposite of what bourbon producers would need to see. Consumer resistance that deepens over time is far more dangerous than a temporary reaction that eventually softens. The regional breakdown shows how broad the sentiment runs. Support for a continued boycott was highest in British Columbia, where 80.9% of respondents said they were unlikely to buy American alcohol again if it became available. Ontario followed at 74.7% and Quebec at 73.9%. Those 3 provinces represent the largest alcohol markets in the country. When the boycott sentiment sits above 70% in every major market and tops 80% in British Columbia, it means American producers face consumer resistance across the entire country, not just in one region. The context makes the timing devastating for U.S. producers. Sources told CBC News that the Canadian government is prepared to lift provincial bans on American alcohol sales in exchange for U.S. tariff relief, as negotiators race to reach a deal before new tariffs take effect on August 19th. In other words, the ban itself may soon be lifted, but the poll reveals that lifting the ban would not solve the American industry's problem. Even with the products legally back on shelves, 3/4 of Canadians say they would not buy them. The government concession that bourbon makers have been waiting for may arrive only to find the customers gone. The behavioral evidence supports the polling. Bar owners across Canada describe a striking pattern. Customers did not miss American alcohol at all. One Vancouver area bar that had previously offered a wide range of American spirits found that patrons did not bat an eye at the absence of bourbon. Instead, the ban pushed them to try alcohol they had never had before. There's nothing I love more than giving someone an Indian whiskey, and they're like, "India? I didn't even know India made whiskey," bartender Geds told CBC News. They're producing excellent stuff, it's just we don't get a ton of it. That is the mechanism destroying the American position. The ban did not create deprivation, it created discovery. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. That discovery dynamic is the heart of the bourbon industry's crisis. When American whiskey vanished from shelves, Canadian consumers did not simply wait for it to return. They found alternatives: Canadian whiskeys, Indian single malts, Japanese, and other international spirits, and many of them preferred what they found. A consumer who switches from Kentucky bourbon to a Canadian rye or an Indian single malt and enjoys it has no reason to switch back when the bourbon returns. The habit has changed, the loyalty has moved, and rebuilding brand loyalty is far harder and slower than losing it. The distinction between a policy problem and a consumer problem is what makes this a historic crisis rather than a temporary setback. A trade dispute is one thing. It ends when governments reach a deal. But losing customers because they no longer want your product is a fundamentally different challenge. Provincial liquor boards removing American products from shelves was a policy action that a policy reversal could undo. Canadian consumers deciding they prefer other options is a market shift that no trade agreement can reverse. The bourbon industry can win back shelf space through the negotiations. It cannot win back preference through them. The commercial damage already inflicted has been severe. U.S. wine exports to Canada fell 78% between 2024 and 2025, and American spirit sales dropped 66.3% in the weeks following the initial provincial removals. Brown-Forman, the Kentucky company behind Jack Daniel's, called the shelf removals worse than a tariff because a tariff raises the price of a product still available, while removal eliminates the sales entirely. Now, the Nanos data suggests the damage extends beyond the removal itself. Even restoring availability may not restore the sales, because the consumers who drove those sales have found other brands they intend to keep buying. Canada is one of the most important export markets for American whiskey, which is what makes the sustained boycott so dangerous for the industry. Bourbon producers built capacity and distribution around Canadian demand. If that demand does not return even after the ban is lifted, American whiskey companies face falling sales in a major market with no easy replacement. Finding new markets to absorb the lost Canadian volume takes years, and other countries have their own domestic producers and established preferences. The Canadian market that bourbon makers counted on may simply not come back to the level they need. The political dimension reinforces the consumer sentiment. The boycott has become an expression of Canadian identity during the trade conflict, a way for ordinary consumers to respond to American tariffs and the repeated suggestions that Canada become a 51st state. That political motivation makes the boycott stickier than a purely economic one. When buying Canadian alcohol becomes a statement of national solidarity, rather than just a purchasing preference, the behavior becomes harder to reverse even after the underlying trade dispute is resolved. The 74% figure reflects sentiment that has fused consumer choice with national feeling. The provinces themselves add another layer of resistance. BC Premier David Eby said there was not a chance in hell that American alcohol would return to shelves in his province. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford has maintained the ban until a deal is struck. Even as the federal government prepares to offer alcohol as a negotiating concession, provincial leaders control the actual shelves, and some are reluctant to restock American products their constituents have shown they will not buy anyway. That provincial friction means even a federal deal may not produce a uniform return of American alcohol across the country. The Nanos poll captured the fundamental problem in a single number. The bourbon industry has spent the trade war waiting for the ban to lift, treating the dispute as a policy obstacle to be negotiated away. But 74% of Canadians saying they will not buy American alcohol even when it returns reveals that the real obstacle was never the ban, it was the consumers. Canada moved on, and for an American bourbon industry that depended on the Canadian market, winning back customers who have already found something they like better may prove to be a far longer and harder fight than the trade war itself.